Hi there, good evening, very warm welcome to this hustings event organised by the Scottish Food Coalition. I'm Brian Taylor. For roughly 1,000 years, indeed since the Middle Ages, I've been covering Scottish politics and Scottish parliamentary elections and covering UK elections before that as well. But as of now, I'm a political pundit, political analyst, and also I'm a columnist in the Herald. I'm absolutely delighted to be taking part in this event tonight, because if politics is to matter at all, it must be about the fundamentals, and I would suggest to you there's nothing more fundamental to us all than food to nurture us. But of course, that very elemental focus must in itself contain subdivisions, sub-elements, and the ones we're going to look at tonight are jobs in the sector, health, poverty, and then climate and nature. We'll discuss these in turn with speakers from the main parties. I should say, as was mentioned earlier, this event will be recorded. I'm delighted to welcome, well, I hope I'm delighted to welcome shortly, Jim Fairley from the SNP, Brian Whittle from the Conservatives, Rhoda Grant from Labour, Liam MacArthur from the Liberal Democrats, and Mags Hall from the Greens. Thank you all for attending, and thanks to the audience for attending in such amazing numbers, and thanks for the questions. We've got dozens and dozens of questions in. We'll try and sift them even still and put those questions to the panel shortly. But to set the scene, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome the chair of the Scottish Food Coalition, Professor Mary Brennan. Mary.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. It's amazing to see from the poll that we have representatives from every region in the country this evening. So I will start and just set the scene and introduce you to the coalition. So as Scotland, where we all meet our recommended dietary goals, where dietary related illnesses are the exception, not the norm, where our most vulnerable are adequately housed, fed with dignity and supported to rise out of poverty, where we do no harm to our natural land, water and marine resources and reverse declining biodiversity, where we use farming techniques which work in harmony with our natural resources and raise livestock to the highest international welfare standards, where we use creative public food procurement to support local enterprises, create skilled jobs and sustain communities, where our agri-food and food and drink workers are valued for the essential work they do, afforded greater job protection and security, and paid at least a living wage, where communities use food to reduce social isolation, improve physical and mental well-being, and enhance community cohesion, is a vision neither difficult to imagine nor politically contested. What is difficult, though, is just how messy, protracted and interrupted progress towards this attainable vision for a fairer, healthier and sustainable Scotland has been. Despite cross-party support for the introduction of a Good Food Nation bill throughout the last Parliament and from many of the parties represented here this evening, progress has been painfully slow with no bill forthcoming. While some mitigation is acknowledged for Brexit and the ongoing COVID-19 crisis, what both have individually and collectively taught us is just how precious, fragile and precarious our food system is, and how urgently food systems transformation is required. Formed in 2016, the Scottish Food Coalition is a coalition of civil society organisations, all working towards a just transition to a fairer, healthier and sustainable food system that works for all, individuals, communities, workers, businesses, natural resources and animals. We bring together a diversity of interests, goals and priorities across our breadth of organisations, a broad base of interdisciplinary, internationally informed and practically grounded expertise, networks of geographically dispersed stakeholders and communities working towards a fairer, healthier and sustainable food system, and a community with lived experiences of how the current food system actively works against them, thriving as individuals, communities and enterprises. We as a coalition embrace the messiness, demonstrating how barriers to systemic change can be knocked down by opening up, reaching out and really listening to each other through honest and respectful partnership working. We ask difficult questions about our place within and responsibilities to our food system. We consider the different interests, power dynamics and resources available to different stakeholders and how these influence who is heard, what sectors and markets are supported, and the balance struck between domestic and export food and drink priorities. We amplify the voices and lived experiences of those so often unheard. And we reach across the political divide and multiple governmental portfolios, civil service departments and public agencies impacted by and responsible to our food system. And through all this, we are working to develop evidence-based solutions to the wicked systemic problems preventing Scotland from committing to groundbreaking food systems transformation. In the husting tonight, you will watch a few short videos from our coalition partners and hear from spokespeople from the main political parties about their vision for the Scottish food system and how this impacts jobs, health, priority and nature and climate. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to the vibrant and exciting debate to follow.
Mary, thanks very much indeed. Vibrant and exciting indeed. Let's hope it is too. But that was an expert analysis and an expert introduction to the discussion I'm going to have tonight. Okay, straight to video. A brief explainer first about Scotland's food system related to jobs.
Our food system plays a big role in Scotland's economy. It creates both wealth and poverty. In rural areas, 1 in 12 people work in agriculture, while 1 in 10 of all Scottish jobs are estimated to be dependent on agricultural activity and primary produce. Yet even prior to the pandemic, many of those who work to produce, harvest, process, sell and serve food struggle to make ends meet. 48% of all people working in the food sector in the UK are paid below the real living wage. Retail and hospitality alone account for 1/3 of all workers in poverty. Food workers have also been very heavily hit during the pandemic. The hospitality sector has a higher proportion of furloughed staff and expected redundancies than any other profession. Those in retail, food manufacturing and logistics worked throughout lockdown to keep the food system functioning. They have suffered some of the highest death rates. Amongst men, 4 of the top 10 occupations with the highest COVID-19 mortality rate were in the food system. The Scottish Government celebrates the continued growth of the food and drink sector. However, there is an urgent need to look beyond exports and address the major challenges of employment abuse.
Problems as seen from the perspective there of the union side. Now, we've got loads of questions on jobs. I'm going to take those shortly, but I think a generic question first to get us going, one that's got the most support, frankly, from our audience in terms of being put to the panel. Lenka Kunartova asking, will the parties reintroduce the Good Food Nation bill, and how will they make sure it's not forgotten or pushed down the agenda? Let's go, if we can, right away to Jim Fairley from the SNP. Welcome, Jim. What's your take on the Good Food Nation bill? Should it be reintroduced? Is it a goer?
Hello, Brian. It's lovely to be here. Thanks very much for inviting me along, folks. I'm delighted to be here tonight. I think the simple answer to the question is yes. I think the Good Food Nature bill is definitely to be back on the agenda. It was supposed to have been introduced last year, but I know that the pandemic has caused major problems throughout the industry, as we know. But I think the plans would definitely be to bring it back. I will stand corrected if that's not the case, but I'm pretty sure it will.
So it's still supported in principle, Jim. I mean, there was some suggestion. It fell through the net the last time, and the suggestion was that the pandemic and Brexit preparation was dominating everything else. But there was also some suggestion from some that the SNP government had a bit of cold feet on the subject. You're saying that's not the case?
Well, as far as I know, bear in mind, Brian, I am the first-time candidate in this in this election, so I am not privy to all of the things that have happened prior to the breakup of the Parliament. But as far as I know, yes, the Good Food Bill is definitely something that will be revisited in the next Parliament.
Okay, let's bring in Brian Whittle from the Conservatives. Brian, good to hear from you.
The Good Food Nation bill actually was probably one of the most important bills that could have been brought forward in the last Parliament, and it kept being kicked. The can kept being kicked down the road. I was so disappointed in the way in which it kept moving. It was in the Parliament 3-4 years ago, and it just kept moving and moving and moving. it has the capability of changing the way in which the whole food landscape across a whole wide variety, including in terms of poverty, including in the way in which we produce food and which we support our farmers. And it kept being kicked down the road. It has to come back. It should have been done in the last Parliament. There was the excuses that have been made, quite frankly, don't wash for me. Brexit had nothing to do with it. This is a Scottish bill, and we could have made a huge amount of difference by bringing forward the Good Food Nation bill. It was something that I called for and fought for all the way along, because I think it's so incredibly important. It must come back in the next Parliament, and it must be given the credibility that it needs.
Brian, thanks for that. Rhoda Grant from Labour. This section, of course, on jobs. We heard that really poignant plea from the union side as well. What about the Good Food Nation bill in that context?
The Good Food Nation bill has to happen. It's something we've been pushing for. And frankly, it should have been done long before Brexit and long before COVID, because you're looking for a really complex bill that takes our food production from the field right through to the fork, to the people that eat it, and that includes the farm workers, many on very low wages, through to the distribution workers, again, low wages. But also we've got a problem with food poverty, we've got a problem with malnutrition in the form of obesity and the like. We need to deal with all of those problems, and you're not going to do a quick bill at the end of a parliament. You need a proper bill that takes in the whole thing in the round, and therefore.
So you think in practice it was right to shelve the bill to try and give it greater scrutiny? Brian Whittle saying it was dumped for other reasons.
It was absolutely dumped, and it should have been done much earlier in the parliament. That's what I'm saying, because you don't leave the last year of a parliament to rush in such a major change. You need to do it properly.
Rhoda, I'm going to come to that subject of the real living wage in just a second. Several good questions of that. But on this Good Food Nation bill, I'm going to bring in Liam MacArthur and then Mags Hall. Liam first, please. Good to hear from you.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks to the Coalition for the invitation. Like Brian and Rhoda, I think it's fair to say that the SNP dumped this bill. COVID and Brexit became a bit of a catch-all excuse for a whole series of things not happening. I think it was clear that the SNP government really didn't have much of an idea what they were going to put in this bill, and that's why it was quietly pushed to the side. Certainly, Rhoda's right that trying to kind of shoehorn it in at the back end of the session would have been a mistake as well. I think in terms of ideas about what a Good Food Nation bill might include, the coalition's provided a manifesto with which you can agree or disagree, but it certainly provives enough food for thought across all the themes that we're going to cover this evening.
Which do you agree or disagree with that manifesto?
Well, I think we can have that debate, and we will have this evening. And as you bring forward a bill, you would have to then have that debate. I mean, I don't think simply legislation is always the answer to achieving the goals that the coalition wish to pursue. It's an important.
It sounds, Liam, as forgive me for interrupting. It sounds as if you're saying there's no consensus, it sounds as if it was perhaps reasonable for the Scottish government to put the issue on hold until we gain some form of consensus across.
No, I think there was consensus about the need for a Good Food Nation bill. There wasn't necessarily consensus about all the elements of it, but there isn't a piece of legislation that's ever been brought forward, I don't think, by any government that's had 100% consensus from beginning to end. I mean, that's what the legislative process is there to do. But I think there's no doubt that in the next session of Parliament we're going to have to return to this. And as I say, I think
thanks for that. Let's bring in Mags Hall from the Greens.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me here today. So the Scottish Greens in our 2016 manifesto included a commitment to an integrated food farming and environment act, which, to all intents and purposes, is the Good Food Nation bill, and it will be in our manifesto next time around as well. I think we've heard from all the parties here about how much consensus there was for the need for a bill. And also, let's not forget, there is no doubt here that the Scottish Government shelved this bill prior to the pandemic. The Food Commission published their recommendations back in 2017 and included the recommendation of primary legislation. And in their response to that, the Scottish Government said that the primary legislation was necessary. Here's a long list of nice policy ideas that we're taking forward anyway. And the only reason the Good Food Nation bill was still on the timetable, was in the programme for government in 2019-2020, is because all the other opposition parties worked together, bring an amendment to the debate in Holyrood to get it back on the agenda again. So I think it was a very good example of how the Scottish Parliament and how opposition parties in the Scottish Parliament work together to bring forward legislation and to bring forward an agenda that is very widely supported and which a minority government might shelve. So I look forward to working with the opposition parties next session to hopefully bring that back again.
Jim Fairley raising a pointed finger there, and I think it's reasonable. The accusation from pretty well all of your opponents is that it was quietly shelved by the Scottish Government for reasons of expediency rather than time.
Well, I don't know why it was shelved at that time, other than that I know that Brexit and the COVID crisis have brought in major challenges to the Scottish Government.
Yeah.
Sorry, did somebody try and come in across me there?
No, please carry on.
No. So there is nobody can say that there's any excuse. It's not an excuse. COVID happened. Brexit happened. We didn't want Brexit to happen. And COVID was out with our control. But what I can tell you is that prior to the SNP coming in as the Scottish Government in 2007, there wasn't even such a thing as a national food policy for Scotland. So the criticism that is being aimed at the SNP tonight is a little bit unjustified, because nobody has done any more for the Scottish food and drink sector and for the agricultural sector than the SNP has done since they come into power. And I know that because I've worked in the sectors, I've worked in farming, I've worked in the food and drink sector, and I know what it was like to try and get any kind of tangible conversation going prior to 2007. And Liam, I will give you a certain amount of respect here in the fact that Ross Finney certainly tried his best, but nothing happened to the quality and the quantity of what's happening now until the SNP came into power in 2007.
Jim Fairley, thanks. I see Rhoda Grant shaking her head. Rhoda, I also want to bring you in a question from Heather Anderson on the jobs theme. What can we do, Heather asks, to ensure that the real living wage is paid to retail and hospitality workers, in other words, directly in this sector? Rhoda, on that, please, and what you've heard.
Yes, and in the sector, those people, retail have taken the brunt of the pandemic, and the hospitality sector have lost their jobs because of that. And we know now how much we depend on things like hospitality because we've had to miss it. We need to pay the real living wage. It is a disgrace in a wealthy country where people are living in poverty, living out of food banks, and people who are going to work and working long hours. We have to do that. And that actually boosts the economy. If we pay people properly, they have more spending power. And, I hear what Jim was saying about the SNP, but all they have done is spoken. They haven't actually done anything. They could have brought forward this Good Food Nation bill. It had consensus throughout the Parliament that a bill was needed, and we could have coalesced behind that. The Food Coalition had done the work on it. It's just an excuse. It was too complicated. And the moment you empower people within an industry, obviously there's winners and losers, and that's what they're afraid of.
Brian Whittle, on that point about the real living wage, is that affordable to the farm and processing and retail sector? Do you believe it is?
Well, actually, if you look at the farm and retail sector currently, our food producers, if you look at the Excel contract, which is the contract that all of our food goes to schools and hospitals and whatnot, is bought by the local government. That there's only 16% of that is actually purchased from Scotland. The rest of it comes from abroad. So we charge our farmers with producing the highest quality food, and we charge them with paying the living wage. We charge them with custodianship of the countryside. We charge them with, the highest standards of animal welfare. And then when it comes down to it, in a government Excel contract, we won't buy their produce because it's too expensive.
But are you saying that we need to reduce, therefore, the costs upon our farmers and other producers, and that we cannot afford to pay the real living wage in this sector? Is that what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is that in a central Excel contract, like a government contract, we should be looking at the local food production, going to schools, going to hospitals, going to prisons. That's what we should be doing, and it can be done, done in the budget, because East Ayrshire currently spend 75% of their budget goes on local produce. So it can be done. It just takes the will from the Scottish Government to actually do it. We can absolutely pay the living wage, and we can absolutely support our local farmers. It just takes the will to do it. And I've said this in the Parliament time and time again, and that's why the Good Food Nation bill was absolutely required to bring this to bear.
Thanks, Hall. To bring a couple of other questions as well. Robert Morris I'll just give the end of his question. He says he's a small-scale free-range poultry producer struggling to make a decent income from the money that's currently paid to farmers. Jo Hunt, she has a veg box scheme she runs from her croft. She can't recruit people, and she wants a training program at degree level in local food production. What about these sort of ideas coming through about enhancing the nature of the sector? Mags first, then Liam.
Yeah, lots of different ideas there, and I think we do need to start looking. We have to look right across the board as to, there's two different issues in the questions that you've raised there. There's the issue about how we make farming profitable, how we make it a business that can be supported and actually pays, but then also how do we draw people into the industry? So wages are a big part of that. I would love to see everybody, this is a particular low wages, a particular issue for this sector, but quite frankly, entitled to the living wage. The Greens want to see the national minimum wage replaced with a real living wage for everybody, regardless of what sector that they'd like to live in, that they would work in. But unfortunately, that's not within the power of the Scottish Parliament at the moment. So we're having to go cap in hands and ask the Conservative government to please put the minimum wage up so that people can actually live off their wages. In terms of the question there around struggling to get people to work in veg box schemes.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So education is often a factor in that, and access to rural education is incredibly difficult, particularly if you come from a farming background or if you come from a rural area. But I live down in Fife, and if even in a semi-rural area like this, there is very little. There's no accessible education for people in my end of Fife if you want to go into agriculture or food and farming sector. So we have some fantastic rural colleges at the moment, but they're only available to people in certain areas. It's very difficult for people to have that transition from school to further education to move on. So we can be doing a lot more with our rural colleges and offering this kind of education.
Max, thanks very much indeed. Congratulations on living in Fife. You're very, very close to the cradle of civilization, which of course is on the other bank of the Tay in Dundee. Let's bring in Liam MacArthur. Liam, on this point about training, this point about the real minimum wage, real living wage rather, this point that Brian Whittle was referring to about the costs in the farming sector as well. The economy really related to this overall question of jobs.
I think that latter point, I think, speaks to the interconnection between all of these issues. I mean, I think some of that reflects what we're seeing in terms of the concerns around a post-Brexit environment about both the standards that will apply in the environment and animal welfare, etc., and the demands that we will place on those we are trading with through the deals that we strike. I mean, there's no point demanding of our farmers and our crofters and our food producers that they attain certain levels of animal welfare, environmental impacts, etc., and then simply give a free pass to those that are importing into the country. So that I think is certainly something we need to bear in mind. I think the point that Mags was touching on there in terms of education and skills, that I think speaks to one of the problems with the food sector generally, and Scott earlier was talking about 1 in 10 being employed in food-related sector. In Orkney, that figure is significantly higher, but I think very often those roles are devalued. So what I wouldn't necessarily want to see is a requirement to a degree level to enter or to be a part of whatever part of the sector. But we certainly need to value these jobs more and provide pathways so that you get skills development and paying people a living wage that allows them to have, I think, feel valued in the roles that they're performing.
Thanks, Liam, and thanks to the panel. Let's hold all of these thoughts. Let's move on to the topic. As I say, they're all related. They're interrelated. Jim, if you just hold your thought for a second, I'll bring you back very early in the next one. No, was it one point you wanted to make? Go on then, Jim Fairley. If it's only 1 point, please go on.
Yeah, the very specific thing we're talking about there, I 100% agree with that point. Because one of the things that we have as a real problem in this country is the fact that we don't value waiters, waitresses, chefs. They don't get the top chefs, yes, but those who are working in the front of house, there is not enough appreciation that is a real skill. It's a real business acumen business that you need to have skills to do. and we need to value it much better than we do at the moment.
Jim, thanks for that. I'm going to move on to the topic of health. Let's move on to that topic with a scene-setting video, please.
Food is inextricably linked to health. The COVID-19 pandemic has put food and health into the spotlight and shown why the food system must be a priority in Scotland. The lockdown measures implemented have generally exaggerated existing issues around food.
Diet in Scotland is poor, and access to good nutritious food is becoming more difficult. A poor diet, both eating too much and not eating enough, is linked to many health issues, including underweight, malnutrition, obesity, type 2 diabetes, cancer, falls and dementia. 2/3 of Scottish adults are either overweight or obese, and over a quarter of our children are at risk of becoming overweight or obese, the consequences of which are still to come.
At least 1 in 10 older people are at risk of or are suffering from underweight malnutrition in the UK. This equates to approximately 103,000 older people in Scotland, with new data from Eat Well Age Well suggesting this figure could be higher at up at 30%. Obesity and underweight malnutrition are 2 examples of how people's health in Scotland are affected by the food system. When discussing and intervening in the food system, we need to bear in mind its power to either worsen or improve national health. Food and the food system must be a governmental priority if we are to ensure the short and long-term health of Scotland's population.
Michael Moore saying around 6 in 10 adults in Scotland carrying excess weight, asking how the parties plan to achieve higher levels of healthy weight across Scotland. Vicky White, maybe a more generic one. How will you improve access to fresh, healthy food for all Scots? On this topic, let's bring in Brian Whittle. Brian, please.
On my topic now.
I called you.
There's only the three key elements to healthy lifestyle are food, physical activity, and inclusivity, and all of these things are intrinsically linked. We are the unhealthiest nation in Europe, the unhealthiest small country in the world, but we are actually one of the wealthier countries in the world. So there's something being lost here in the connections. There's a number of things. We've got a lost knowledge of how to eat healthy. We had a sort of, if you like, perfect storm in the 80s when we lost the extracurricular activity at schools was decimated, along at the same time when we had the rise in the fast food outlets, and we have lost our way in the ability of looking after ourselves in terms of healthy food. I think one of the key points was talked out earlier on about access to fresh fruit and vegetables, and it's all very well educating, using the education system to correct this, and it'll take decades. It won't happen in a parliamentary term. I think this is one of the big issues that we have. It will take decades, but the problem is, especially in the lower SIMD areas, is access to fresh fruit and vegetables locally is very poor. It's much worse than it is in the higher SIMD areas. So it's a multi-complex, very complex issue, but it has to be tackled, because the one thing that COVID has taught us above anything else is how much the health of the nation impacts the economy. So for me, if you want to grow the economy, we have to look at health. And if you want to look at health, we have to look at the education system.
Brian Whittle, thanks for that. Question from Joyce Wilcox. Just going to feed this into the mix. I'm going to go to Rhoda Grant next on this issue of improving Scotland's health through the food. Joyce Wilcox talking about something, picking up from something Brian Whittle said there. Poor quality, she says, fast food outlets allowed to remain open during the pandemic. She wants support for better quality restaurants selling what she calls real food, local produce, and get them back on their feet. Rhoda Grant, on this point about a healthier nation.
And I don't think it's about restaurants or fast food. It's about access to food. Anyone who looks at food and the price of food, if you look at fruit and vegetables, it's relatively expensive compared to things like cheap food with a lot of fat, with a lot of sugar, that causes all the health problems. Now, people say, well, can we afford to allow, sell this cheaper? Can we afford to give people more access? Actually, we can't afford to allow people to have such unhealthy diets because it's a cost to the NHS. We've seen with COVID, people with poorer health outcomes, people with obesity fell.
But how do you prevent this, Rhoda? How do you prevent this? I mean, if people have choice, they are choosing a certain type of food, and you really, how do you intervene in that to make the choice different?
Brian, I would argue that it's not always down to choice, it's down to affordability. If you're on a very tight budget and you've got kids to feed, you're going to buy a sausage roll, you're going to buy beans, you're going to buy chips because it's much cheaper than buying fresh fruit and veg. Now, there's good things that are going on out there like community gardens, but actually we have to just turn this on its head. And a Good Food Nation bill would have had a right to food in it. That's a human right, not a right to just cheap, awful food, but the right to a nutritious diet.
But again, how do you narrow that down? I'm going to bring in. I take your point. I'm going to bring in others. I'm going to bring in Mags Hall on this. The healthy food question that we're getting range of questions from the participants here.
Yeah. No, I agree with Rhoda there that in the vast majority of cases, this isn't a choice. This is just people having to find the circumstances that they're finding themselves in. And diet-related ill health is inextricably linked to poverty as well. So first of all, we have to. I know we're going to move on to talk about poverty later on. So
that's fine. Carry on.
More into that. There are other measures as well to try and increase access. The Greens in this last session, my colleague Alison Johnson was instrumental in the government to adopt a healthier, wealthier children approach to benefits and support for families, and particularly families in SIMD areas. Means that right from, in fact, even before a child's born, families are given support and directed to make sure that they're getting the financial support they need, but also that they're getting the peer support and access to services that they need as well. And hopefully we're going to see the benefit of that over the coming years, but ensuring that people are getting the benefits and the funding that they're entitled to right from an early age is important. Greens also want to see the rollout of a much more diverse local retailing landscape so that access to fresh fruit and vegetable is available. So looking at locally run cooperatives which have affordable fruit and vegetables in areas which historically have been food deserts as well. Then the other really important way that we can make fruit and veg more accessible in Scotland is through our agricultural support scheme as well. I mean, we put £775 million a year in agricultural support, and a tiny fraction of that goes towards the horticulture sector because it's not seen as a priority. Imagine what we could do if right at the start of the food chain in Scotland, we were diverting our funding towards the food that we know that we should be eating more of, but that at the moment isn't affordable and accessible to people.
Max, thanks very much for that. I'm going to bring in the other panelists in a second, but as Brian Whittle, I saw you looking decidedly sceptical during perhaps more it was Rhoda's contributions than Mag's, but I think I saw a shake of the head. Just bring you in briefly again, please.
Yeah, I think, this access to healthy food is absolutely fundamental here, because I think locally, the access to in shops and whatnot of healthy fruit and vegetables is not as good as it is in the more wealthy areas. That's number one. But the key here is we've lost the education of it. It's not enough to there's a reason why shopkeepers don't stock that stuff. It's because people don't buy it and don't know what to do with it. That is a problem, because I've had to learn when I went to Parliament. I had to learn to make a pot soup because I took it through to and froze it and took it through. It doesn't cost a lot of money, and it's quality food. People are choosing fast food over good food, not because they don't want to look after themselves or look after their children. They've lost the education for it. It's not just enough to give them access. We have to, and that's been proven a lot of third sector organisations who are helping people back into that way of life. So it's not as simple as Rhoda was saying.
Thanks for that. Let's bring in Liam MacArthur, please. Liam, I saw you smiling gently during some of the contributions as well.
Smiling gently because I think anybody that knows anything about my diet will take with more than a pinch of salt me lecturing anybody on how they should be eating better.
Only a pinch now, only a pinch, yeah.
I think we've seen evidence of where public health interventions can be successful. I mean, the smoking ban is the obvious one, but I think there is a risk here that in simply saying what this needs to be is a right and access to good food is in of itself, and indeed affordable good food is in itself going to be sufficient. I remember talking to the lead official in Denmark, who then went on to work in the Nordic Council, about the success they'd had in Denmark in terms of improving diet. And what they'd managed to achieve without legislation, it has to be said, was a pride in the local ingredients and the local foods in different parts of the country, but also, to Brian's point, a kind of enthusiasm for the preparation of it. I mean, it's not always cooking it. I mean, we have good food and then we boil it within an inch of its life. The preparation of the food is in of itself part of the experience of enjoying good food. And I think, unfortunately, the message about speed and rapidity is what you need in modern times. Well, no, there's something to be gained from actually the way in which you engage with food. We are one of these nations that does not celebrate our food in the way that the French do, the Italians do, the Spaniards do. Meal times are in of themselves part of the point, part of the purpose, and therefore I think there's so many different strands to this. Simply baking into legislation a right isn't going to be sufficient, because I know only too well that telling my kids that they have a right to eat fresh fruit and vegetables is going to meet with limited success, particularly when the right is handed over by me, who maybe doesn't have the best track record in walking the talk in that respect.
Well, never mind. After the pandemic's over, it's all round to Brian Whittles for a bowl of soup. But prior to that, Jim Fairley, on this point about healthy food, how we encourage healthy food, how do you alter choice? Is it about spending power? What do you make of what you've heard? Jim Fairley. Jim. Oh, we've lost him. Never mind. Let's bring in Rhoda Grant again, please, and we'll try and get Jim back on.
I get that some of it is about knowing what to do with food, but if you can't afford a lot of food, you're not going to be mucking about and wasting it. You're going to do you're not going to let your children learn. So, it's a vicious circle that people who are in food poverty are facing. One, they can only access poor quality food, but two, they can't really teach their children if they don't have the access to food they need. So we need to make sure, and looking at things like local production, because the further away from the food you are, the more expensive it becomes, because everyone in that food chain takes their cut. If the producer is selling direct to the consumer, then they're selling it at a much lower price and is much fresher, much easier to access. We need to shorten those food chains.
Thanks for that, Mags. I saw you looking pretty sceptical during some of the preceding comments, and your smile suggests I've called it right. On you go.
Yeah, so I have a background in community food work and community food education in particular, and I have worked amongst low-income communities across the east of Scotland delivering education programmes, and I have learned more from the people who I have taken classes with than I was ever able to teach them. I understand, and perhaps amongst the younger generation, won't pick as much, and that people need skilled up. But the idea that people don't know how to make a pot of soup, and that's why we have unhealthy diets, is a myth. And it's a myth that's used to demonise poor people, and particularly demonise people who are in work poverty. You can imagine, if you have a family to feed, and you are coming from your day job and you've got an hour to get your kids, get them home from school, get them fed, and out to your evening job, which is the reality for an awful lot of people in work in Scotland today. The last thing that you're going to think about is have I got time to make a pot of soup for them all? No, there's so many circumstances around people's lives that lead them to eat the diets that they are doing. And yes, fair enough, make sure that kids get the opportunity to learn in school how to cook. Make sure that we're putting people in houses that have kitchens properly equipped with them, and that people have money to be able to pay the gas and electricity so that they can cook in the first place. No, I agree with Liam, this is a multi-level approach. Our right to food is important, but we have to be addressing the fundamental inequalities in our society that are putting people in these circumstances.
Thanks, Mags. I'm going to bring in Brian Whittle. Brian, you were trying to get in. Just a comment from Fiona Montgomery, one of the questions. She's saying public services should deliver food for good. She goes into details about the nature of the public services. Free school meals for all school children. She says this helps tackle poverty and improve health. But that's just a point to chuck into the mix. Brian Whittle, on what you're hearing.
Yeah, just what they said. I think the educational environment is hugely important here, and I think that we have the opportunity within the educational environment to make sure that our children have a good balanced diet, and also learn about that good balanced diet. I think that's key. Not just about getting free school meals; it's about getting free quality school meals. I think, as we alluded to earlier on that report. But it's not about demonising. Nobody's demonising anybody. I think, you know, most of the work I've done in Parliament has been in the lower quintile, because for me that's where we have to focus our resource. We have to focus resource locally, because we don't have enough quality food locally. We have too many fast food outlets in the lower SIMD. We have too much access to alcohol and gambling and poor food. We have to focus more resource locally into these areas, because if we don't do that, this problem never changes. It's not about
how do you do that? How do you do that, Brian, and still maintain consumer choice? If you're not to intervene radically in consumer choice, how do you do what you're describing?
That is a government choice. That is a government have the choice to where they put the resource at the moment, and currently it's going to too few. We have to look at our local communities. We have to look at investing in those local communities, and we have to ensure they have at least access to that kind of quality food.
Liam MacArthur, you're keen to get in briefly, if you would. Thanks.
Yeah, I think almost implicit in your question there, Brian, is it's an either or. I think choice will still need to be there. I mean, there was often said of Scotland, if it's we're at risk if it's not banned, it's mandatory. So I think what we need to be doing is incentivising the sorts of things we want to see, without going necessarily to the extent of saying, and anything that doesn't fall into this category needs to somehow be prohibited. I think people will exercise their choice, but as Brian says, part of this is about education, and it's education across, I think, all sectors of society. I think it's particularly maybe prevalent amongst SMID 20, but that's not to say that this isn't an issue affecting the whole population across all demographics. I mean, that's patently obvious from the statistics.
Rhoda Grant, final word on this subject of health before we move on to the next one, which is the subject of poverty. But Rhoda Grant, on the subject of health, please.
Yeah, I think we have to give people the choice and the ability to make the right choices, and that's about wealth. It really comes down to wealth and having the money in their pockets that allow them to make those choices. So therefore, a real living wage is really the nub of this, that people earn a living, that they can go and make the choices and aren't left eating food that really isn't good for them because they have no choice. It's all they can afford.
Okay, thanks for that. Thanks very much indeed for that. A very good discussion on that topic, and thanks to those who submitted questions. Apologies I wasn't able to take anything like the full gamut of the questions put in. Let's move on. A question really arising from the comments made by Rhoda Grant there. The key element in this entire issue, as you mentioned, is poverty, both relative and absolute. In terms of a video, let's take a look at that.
In the 18 months to September 2019, 1,000 emergency food parcels were given out every day in Scotland to people who could not afford to buy food. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, food bank use has soared to new levels, and this only accounts for a fraction of the emergency food distributed in Scotland.
People turn to charities for emergency food when there isn't enough money for the essentials. Everyone should have sufficient income to be able to afford the basics for themselves and their families with dignity and choice. We call on parties to support a cash-first approach instead of relying on the distribution of emergency food aid.
A Good Food Nation bill, founded on the right to food, would place responsibility on the state, not on food bank workers and volunteers, to ensure that everyone has a dignified access to nutritious and sustainably produced food.
Let's look at some of the issues arising out of poverty, and let's go straight to our panel. I'll put some questions to you in a second, but let's go to Mags Hall on that. The issue of poverty, both relative and absolute, and its relation to food production and distribution. Mags Hall first.
Yeah, I couldn't quite hear the video there. But
no. Do it by reading. Yeah, carry on.
That's fine. But no, I did hear one of the contributors there talking about a cash first approach, and absolutely that's what we support in the Scottish Greens. The community food network already existed, and those that popped up at the start of the pandemic last year did an amazing job turning around huge amounts of food in a very short space of time and making sure that people could go without. But quite frankly, they should never have had to do that in the first place. Our society should provide a safety net for people, make sure that they always have the cash in the pockets to access the food that they need. That's why Greens have long supported a universal basic income. We've been delighted to see the support for that grow over the last few years, and the development of the feasibility study that was commissioned across local authorities, including in Fife, was a fantastic step forward on that. So we're advocating for the next session of Parliament for Scotland to hold a full pilot of UBI. We do need permission from the UK government for that to go ahead. And quite frankly, I don't think it's going to be forthcoming. But making sure that everybody has cash in their pockets every month to access food, regardless of whether there's a global pandemic or whether you lose your job or whether you suffer from ill health, it would be the most transformational thing that we can do to tackle both poverty and also make sure that there is equal access in our food system.
Thanks for that. I'm going to bring in Brian Whittle. Brian, a question from Polly Jones, just to, again, chuck it into the mix. Will your party commit to ending the need for food banks by tackling low income to address poverty instead of relying on emergency food distribution? It's really the fundamental question we're asking in this section. And what about that point about a universal basic income? That's not universally popular, is it?
Yeah, well, I think universal income is a really interesting idea, and I think we actually genuinely looked at it during the last term of Parliament, because I think we have to be prepared to accept other ideas and other issues. It is unaffordable, quite frankly, when it came down to it. But I mean, on the face of it, it's a great idea, but we didn't think it was affordable. I think to tackle poverty, there's so many complex issues involved here. We talked about the ability to choose, to be able to choose what we eat. That's fundamental. We've talked about the education system. We've talked about free school meals. I think what we should be looking at during holiday times, for example, is not just free meals, but free access to activity that include food as part of that package. We need to look at bringing services closer to the communities. We need to look at how we, long term, how we keep jobs and quality jobs locally in these areas as well. I'm the southwest, which is the poorest in terms of pay in the whole of Scotland, and that is a transport infrastructure problem. What happens is because there's not good transport infrastructure, businesses don't go there. Therefore, all the youth leave and go into to Glasgow and Edinburgh. So it's a multi-complex problem, and I think I said right at the start, this is not about what we need to do in the next 2-3 years. This is what we need to do over the next 2 or 3 decades. Because it took that long for us to get into the position we're in just now. I think that whole, I'm going to come back to this again, local produce, reducing the distance that's required, that goes from the field to the table, is crucial here in keeping the costs down.
Thanks very much. Liam MacArthur, please, on this subject of poverty in relation to the food sector. If you like some views on the universal basic income, could be chucked in as well. Up to you.
Yes, I think we would be supportive of the principles of UBI. I mean, I think it's been said very often over the last 12 months that actually what COVID has done is exposed some of the frailties, the weaknesses and the inequalities that have long been there within society, but exposed them far more brutally. And I think UBI the principles of UBI would have addressed what we've seen in terms of a succession of well-intentioned, well-motivated schemes brought forward by UK government and Scottish government to try and plug the gaps in terms of where support was needed, but where I think the principles of UBI may well have covered the ground more effectively and stopped so many people falling through the gaps. Yes, it comes at a cost, but I think it has many benefits that would be well worth pursuing. I mean, I think in terms of the link between poverty and poor health. That's very well established. I think it's the institutionalised nature we now have got to with food banks that is highly problematic. And I think communities, certainly the community I was brought up in, those looked out for their neighbours, and sort of food parcels that were never called food parcels were often sort of provided for neighbours and friends on that basis. That isn't necessarily a problem. That is a community looking out for itself. I think what we've seen though is a scale of need that is now only met in the sort of way that food banks have been able to provide, and that is clearly in the 21st century absolutely shameful.
I'll bring in Rhoda Grant in a second, but I'm going to bring Mags back in if you wouldn't mind. Question marks there about the practicality of a universal basic income and whether it's affordable. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, I think over the last months that we've seen, the pandemic has changed our perception and changed our idea about what affordable means. We've been able to move mountains as a society to keep businesses across all sorts of sectors going, to make sure people stay in their jobs whilst businesses were closed, and it has been a great response. And I think on the back of that, we need to rethink what government spending is for and where it needs to be directed. But also, this is another reason why we need to see trial, and we need to see the pilots and the feasibility report that brought out into the pilot. It's not in a pilot in Scotland, provided options for a number of different models. And it would be good to look at those, because there are different ways to deliver this. But it's very easy to write this off as unaffordable when you haven't looked into the other benefits that it brings. So things like increased entrepreneurship through people being able to set up their own businesses and micro businesses from home because they've got the backup of a UBI. Additional health and welfare benefits that it brings as well. In pilots that have been done in other countries have shown one of the biggest benefits comes towards people's mental health, because they're not stressed and worried about how they're going to feed themselves or keep a roof over their head. Think about the costs that brings, so the savings that brings to society through overall improved mental health. So yeah, it's very easier to just put a barrier up and say this is too difficult, but we need to press ahead. We need to trial it in Scotland. We need to come up with a model that works for Scotland, because this is what government should be doing to try and support people and to make sure that there is a safety net for people in Scotland.
Thanks, Liam. I saw you trying to get back. I'll bring in Rhoda in a second, but Liam, just for a brief moment, you wanted to come back in.
Just very briefly, to follow up Mags's point, which I think is absolutely spot on. I mean, ultimately, this is what the reforms in welfare and benefits was supposed to be about at a UK level. It was supposed to be about removing the cliff edges, where if you moved in and out of employment or your circumstances changed, you faced these cliff edges. The universal basic income principles, and Mags is right, there are different ways you can cut this, but in a sense, what it does is it smooths out that process in a way that doesn't put people in an almost impossible position in terms of the choices that are facing.
Okay, thanks for that. Rhoda Grant, you've been very patient. I'm going to stress we've lost connection with Jim Fairley at the moment, as you've probably gathered, but we're trying everything possible known to man and woman to get him back in. But delighted to welcome Rhoda Grant on this subject of poverty and food at the moment. Rhoda, please.
Yeah, I mean, I was growing up, we didn't have a lot of money, but we weren't aware of food banks. Food banks are a very new thing in our society. When I started working, there were some organisations that did have food banks. Women's Aid, where people literally fled with the clothes on their back. They got enough food to last them a day, maybe 2 days. By then the benefit system had kicked in and they were getting their own money, could afford their own food. Food banks, is only 1 or 2 decades where food banks have become the answer, and that's because we're not giving people enough money. Things like universal credit has been a nightmare. People who are living to hand to mouth, having to wait a month to get food and money to buy food, that's absolutely ridiculous. And people are saying we can't afford this, we can't afford it. Actually, we're paying a price for this right now. We're paying a price in mental health and physical health and life expectancy and all the social problems that go with poverty, alcoholism, drug addiction. All those things have a cost. Our children are not thriving. They're not getting the proper education. That is a cost that we are paying now, and it's a cost of failure. we have to change where we put our money to make sure that everyone gets a chance to have a proper diet and a proper chance at life, because people just don't, and if we don't feed them properly. So, you know, the cost we are paying is a case of change where you are putting your investment. Invest in people, don't pay for failure.
Brian Whittle, would you comment on that, perhaps particularly the suggestion from Rhoda Grant that the policies brought in by the UK government have been inimical in the subject of benefits?
I think, you know, I mean, I've you know, as my colleagues know, I've spoken about this in the Parliament before. I think the idea of the idea of universal credit was reasonably well received across all parties. If I'm going to be completely honest, as in many government policies, as I found out in my time, it was very poorly implemented, and without question that had an impact. But the actual idea of universal credit is a good one. I mean, I think that Ian Duncan-Smith resigned on the back of having his budget cut, and the government later on had to reinstate that budget. So, you know, I'm not going to defend that at all. I think that is something that had an impact. I mean, Rhoda Grant's right. Food banks in this country are a disgrace. We should not have food banks in this country. So, I think where we differ is how we tackle that, and certainly how we tackle that in the long term. I think I'm going to go back to this again. How do we deliver, you know, an education system that gives our kids access to opportunity long term? And I wanted to go back just on the point of the universal basic income covert, if I could, is that, you know, we are in unprecedented times, and the way that the government have supported, both governments have supported businesses at a level never before. That will have to be paid back. That's not free money. That will have to be paid back, and the tax implications of a universal basic income there. We won't be able to raise enough money in Scotland to do that. That's the conclusion that we came to, having looked at it as a very interesting idea. So I think, again, multi-complex. It's not just about, you know, it's not just about putting money in people's pocket. It's how do we give people long-term access to proper opportunity that allows them, you know, that better quality of life.
Lee MacArthur, you seem keen to come back in. Just one point, Daniel Yaxley asking, does your party support the right to food? Now, we've discussed that tonight, but again, I want to chuck that into the mix. And if so, how do you see it being used to influence food policy in Scotland, perhaps with regard to this question of poverty? Liam MacArthur.
I think I was actually just scratching my ear, Brian, but happy to.
We're scratching it in a very, very meaningful way.
As in auctions, you always need to be careful. These inadvertent hand movements. I think the right to food is an interesting one, and would obviously be one of the central tenets, I suspect, of a Good Food Nation bill. How that's cast, it would be, I think, a trickier proposition, because if there's a right to only certain types of food, this may be seen as benefiting some over others. But I don't necessarily have any difficulty with that being enshrined in legislation. I think, as I say, the trickier bit will be what that then means in practice, what happens in terms of the resourcing of it, and whether what you're doing actually is providing a better benefit for those who maybe don't necessarily need it as much as others. So it's but that's what legislation is about. You have these broad principles, and then you try to condense it down into black letter law and make sure that the intentions you have are followed through in terms of the consequences of the legislation.
Max Hall, is there a danger that you bring in legislation, a right to food, the Food Nation bill, whatever, but it doesn't actually translate into the action that's required? Perhaps it's you know, broad brush and wide ranging, and doesn't, as Liam says, get down to the nitty gritty of what's needed.
Yeah, no, I agree. It does. The human rights are massively important, and we need to have them enshrined in law to make sure that they're upheld. But it doesn't just stop at that. We have to make sure that this is done with quality. What I'm particularly interested in addition to a right for food, is the creation of a statutory food commission, so that you're not just creating this theoretical right, then you're judging the other policies and the other actions that the government's taking to see how those decisions impact on the affordability of food, on access to food, on, you know, the health of our young people, on school I think so. Human rights is a filter through which we look at the other actions that we are taking as a society and the decisions that we make as a parliament, and judge whether those decisions are improving our food in Scotland, improving our health in Scotland, or whether they're having a negative impact on that as well. So that would be just one practical step that we can take alongside this right to food that actually makes a difference.
Thanks. I'm going to move on to the environment shortly, but I'm going to bring in Rhoda. Yeah, Rhoda, please, final word on this section on poverty. And Rhoda Grant, please.
Yeah, my colleague Elaine Smith consulted on a right to food, and if I'm re-elected, I have pledged to take forward that right to food bill so that is enshrined in Scottish law. I mean, we are a wealthy country. People shouldn't be doing without food. People shouldn't be going hungry. And if we enshrine the right to food, it's not certain kinds of food, it's to have people being able to afford to feed themselves and feed their families, and that's what it's about.
How do you define that? Do you define it in terms of the availability of a certain volume of food, availability of a certain number of calories or kilojoules? I mean, how do you manage to define that in practice, given that you're making the law rather than making an ambition?
I think we know what a healthy diet looks like. I mean, people have said not everyone understands what, good nutrition is. Well, we do understand what good nutrition is, and it's being able to afford that for your family, to being able to afford fruit, vegetables, protein, and carbohydrate, rather than just the kind of food that people in poverty at the moment are eating, which is really not good for them. And we save by doing that. We, by improving the health of the nation, by improving the life chances of people, we actually save money. So in a way, we can't afford not to do it, is my belief.
I was going to leave her a lot, but Liam, were you scratching your ear again, or was that genuinely a finger raised this time?
No, I mean, I think Rhoda's right. We know what a good diet looks like, but we also know that a diet that includes maybe some stuff that we shouldn't eat or shouldn't eat all that often is part of making an interesting diet. And I think politicians are probably at their most ineffective when they're seen to preach and lecture. And therefore, I think the right to food is absolutely a sensible one. It's a human right, as Mags has illustrated. But how you then articulate that in law so that it has a meaningful effect on the lives of those that you're principally trying to assist with this legislation is the tricky bit here.
Okay, thanks all. I'm going to move on to the next topic. As you can see, we still haven't got Jim Fairley with us, but we're trying everything possible to get him back, and perhaps we'll get him back in time for the closing discussion. But within all of this, we've talked tonight about jobs, we've talked about health, we've talked there about poverty. A final topic tonight deals with arguably the biggest global challenge of all, a scene setter now from a video on nature and climate.
Scotland's food system is intimately connected to and relies upon the natural world, yet certain farming and fishing practices are accelerating both the nature and climate crises. For example, a quarter of Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture and related land use. Much of our marine life, all marine reef habitats, some of our wildlife associated with farmland, including a range of pollinating insects and birds, such as lapwings, are all declining. Meanwhile, intensive animal farming and the disregard for animal welfare contributes greatly to the spread of zoonotic diseases and antimicrobial resistance. It doesn't have to be this way. Farmers, crofters and fishers can work in tandem with nature whilst not contributing to the climate crisis, and can restore and create habitats such as peatlands and oyster reefs. These can store carbon and provide homes for wildlife. With the right government support and business practice, we can make a food system that works for Scotland's nature and for our climate.
Our closing session tonight on nature and climate. Let's take a question right away. Mary Popple asking, very, very fundamental question. What are your policies for encouraging sustainable farming with a focus on climate-friendly agriculture? Let's call Mags Hall on that one first, please.
Big question. Where do we start? So first of all, we need to see whole-scale reform of our agricultural support policy, and I think in addition to the cross-party agreement that there has been on the Good Food Nation bill, one of the biggest areas of agreement we've seen over the last year has been over the last session in Holyrood has been the failure to move forward with our farming support policy and to start to develop a post-Brexit vision for Scotland's agriculture. There has been no progress on this in the last 5 years at all. This is despite other parts of the UK, such as Wales, having a full revision of agriculture policy within a couple of years of the Brexit vote. This is also despite Europe moving forward with their common agricultural policy and developing an agricultural policy that has the at its heart. What we've done in Scotland is copy and paste the old version of the CAP and say we'll keep it going until 2024 and then we'll see what it's like after that. Quite frankly, is unacceptable. It is a complete denial of the situation that we're in Scotland at the moment. Greens were integral in strengthening Scotland's climate bill and achieving the interim target of 75% reduction of our emissions by 2030. But if we're going to have any chance of achieving that, the policies that will help us achieve that will be the ones that we set in the next 5 years. So it's really fundamental that right from day one, in the next parliamentary session, we look at this huge amount of money that we put towards agriculture, and we say, how do we best use that money to make sure that firstly, we're reducing emissions from agriculture, and secondly, and this is equally as important, that we're tackling the nature emergency as well, and ensuring that we are increasing not just the carbon sequestration potential of our farms, but increasing the on-farm biodiversity as well.
Thanks for that, Matt. Yeah, thanks, Max. I'm going to bring in Rhoda Grant on this general topic with a note from Vicky White's concern about the issue of food waste at every level of the supply chain as well. On the topic here of nature and climate and that issue with regard to food production and distribution. Rhoda Grant, please, from Labour.
Again, this has to be part of a Good Food Nation bill that takes our food production all the way through, but we need to look at what is good and what we are doing with the financial support we give to farming. And we've been pushing the Scottish Government, and they're reluctant to look at how they're going to support agriculture going forward. Now, we have some really good practices that are good for carbon sequestration and are good for biodiversity. For example, animals grass-fed, grass is actually a better carbon sink than forestry. That's seldom recognised. We need grazing land, and that's good for biodiversity as well as carbon. But we don't have food labelling that says that beef was grass-fed, which is good for the environment, whereas mass-produced is not good for the environment. So we need to label to educate people, but we also have to pay for those public goods. So when we're looking at farming support, we need to look at the public good. Is it good for reducing carbon? Is it good for biodiversity? Is it sustainable? Therefore, we will look at supporting that, because that's the kind of practice we want to support. So we need to look at it in the round and reward what is good. At the moment, I'm speaking to farmers and crofters who are really keen to do this, but want some direction from government, which they're not getting. But they're also saying that what is in place at the moment doesn't work, especially for small-scale farming and crofting, and they can't qualify for any of that environmental goods funding.
I'm going to move on to bring Brian Whittle. I'm going to give some messages from Ruben Chesters, who's got a very detailed question. He says Scotland lags behind the rest of the world in transitioning to sustainable organic farming. Scotland, he says, had no target for organic agriculture, and it's not a consideration in procurement. He cites some endeavours by the EU, and basically he's looking for prioritising organic local food in procurement. Works in there to this business of nature and the environment. Brian Whittle, please. Brian.
Yeah, this topic actually gets me wound up more than just about any. Our farmers seem to be getting an absolute going over at the moment in terms of the climate change, and yet we produce some of the highest quality food in the world, and we export it and we import other foods. I did a study a while back there. A lot of our root vegetables, a lot of our dairy produce is coming in from Belgium. We're actually quite good at developing that kind of food. And I would say, as Rhoda Grant just said there, grass actually is very good at carbon sequestration. What we tend to do is lump the beef, the development of beef globally. But the way in which our farmers farm beef is vastly different from the way it's done in, you know, Argentina or in the Far East or in the US for that matter. So what we have to, you know, imported food has got to be, that transport is the highest negative effect on our climate. So it comes back to, how do we keep the high quality food that we produce in Scotland locally? That would be, for me, the best way to tackle climate change. And we have to stop attacking our farmers, because if we keep going on and on about our farmers, we'll end up as a country that doesn't produce any food and we have to import all our food. Tell me how that benefits the climate.
Are you saying, Brian, we should place obstacles in the path of these imports, or are you saying that we should try and make our own food production more competitive with those imports? Which?
Well, I'm going to go way back to what I said before. You know, they'd be charging our farmers with producing high quality food and paying the living wage and you know, custodianship of the countryside and high levels of animal welfare. And yet, when it comes down to it, our public services are not prepared to pay for that. We have to be able to, our public services have to pay for that. The Excel contract, the government Excel contract, is 60% from Scotland, and it's a commitment. I can tell you that I've managed to get into from the Conservatives that we will increase that to over 50%. It is doable. It is absolutely doable, because East Ayrshire are sitting at 75% at the moment. We have to stop exporting our food and importing other foods.
Thanks very much indeed. I'm going to open to go to Jim Fairley very, very shortly, but I'm going to bring in Liam MacArthur on this subject of nature and climate and the environmental aspects of food production. Liam, please.
Yeah, I think some of what Brian said there, I would agree with. I mean, there is clearly a transition that needs to take place in agriculture and food production. I think that's pretty much accepted across the board. However, I think we reduce the chances of making that transition successfully if we don't acknowledge some of what is already happening and what has happened over recent years. That's not to say it's universal. It's not to say it doesn't need to go further and faster. But I think you will struggle to persuade people to go with you if you don't acknowledge the steps that they've already taken. And in terms of the quality of the produce that we're producing, in terms of the environmental standards, the animal welfare standards that have been met, I think they are amongst the highest that you will find anywhere. But it's not enough, and we do need to go further. I was interested by the report of Farming for 1.0% last year, involving Nigel Miller, ex-president of the NFU, and others with a real grounding in climate science, who've mapped out not just recommendations about what needs to be done, and what needs to be done will be different in different parts of the country. In my neck of the woods in Orkney, what will be achievable in terms of what you do with the beef farming and sheep farming will be different from what it is down in Fife, what it'll be down in the border. So we need a range of measures there. We need the incentives, the financial incentives to help that transition happen, the skills and the support that's needed in terms of the expertise. And you will also need regulation to say, look, if you're not going to do this voluntarily by X time, this will then become mandated thereafter, and therefore there's an opportunity to transition more smoothly. But I as I say, I think it becomes more difficult to make the case for the changes we absolutely need to see if farmers and crofters continually feel as if they're being hammered over the head, and the strides that they have made are being kind of either ignored or dismissed entirely.
Liam, thanks very much. Jim Fairley, can you hear me? Jim, yeah?
So sorry,
Jim, we're discussing climate and nature and the environment. How do we make farming more organic? Can we do that while at the same time feeding our people? What's the balance to be struck there?
Of course we can. The farming community in this country are so resilient and so able to adapt to whatever the situation is, that the farming community in this country, I have absolutely no doubt, will be able to play their part in the climate change rules that we want, and continue to be able to produce good food. But they're going to need help, and they're going to need support to do it. And I think one of the things that I've done, one of the problems as a farmer, and I know this because I have been a farmer, I've only just recently given it up, One of the problems of being a farmer is you whiles get people telling you what you should be doing in order to produce good food, in order to protect the environment, in order to do animal welfare. But farmers have been doing this for hundreds of years. We know what we're doing. Farmers know what they're doing. They're very, very good at it. So we know we've got a climate crisis, and we know that farming contributes to it. So what Fergus Ewing has done is he's created 5 work streams and 5 expert panels of people who are actually living and working in the industry. And they're pulling together a report so that any decision that comes from the next parliament, if we form the government in the next parliament, the decisions that are going to be made about how we go forward are going to be delivered by the expertise of people who are living and working in the industry. So we've got the beef climate change, we've got the arable climate change, we've got the pig sector, we've got the arable sector, and all of these guys are going to feed in to a melting pot of saying these are the things that we have to do. But you have to also remember, now I've missed a big chunk of the conversation here. You've got to remember that, so I'm not quite sure what's been said previously.
No, carry on.
But we're talking about jobs and how agriculture is more than capable of paying jobs because we support it. If we're going to have a problem in agriculture going forward, in 7 years' time, the UK government are going to remove all support for agriculture completely. We're already £120 million down on the agricultural support that will come into Scotland next year. So it's such a huge, complex issue, this, and I'm so annoyed that my internet has gone down that I've missed so much of this conversation, because it doesn't have to be adversarial. We all agree on the same thing. We want great quality food. We want to support our rural industries. We want to make sure that people can get access to food. And there's nobody sitting on this panel, and there's nobody sitting in the Scottish Government would argue with any of that. How we get there, yes, there's going to be points of difference, but the aim and the objective is absolutely to make sure that this is a good food nation. If we're going to be a good food nation, we have to live like a good food nation. And I don't think there is anything that the Scottish Government has done or hasn't done that would take away from us getting to that end point. The farming community will do their bit. I have absolutely no doubt about that. And they will do it with the support of a Scottish Government if we are elected next year.
Thanks very much indeed, and warm welcome back. We're getting close to the end, but I want to bring in another topic related to the climate and nature. I'm going to summarise the questions just for shortage of time. It's on the subject of fishing and particularly fish farming. Skye Thane asking about salmon farming and describing it as a scandal about millions of fish dying every year from preventable deaths due to sea lice. Grant Reekie talking about destructive fishing, killing some of our most unique ecosystems. So, questions there on farm fishing in particular. I'm going to bring in Liam MacArthur on this one. Liam.
Should probably start by declaring an interest as the son of a former creel fisherman in Orkney. It's the reason I ended up in Orkney in the first instance. Look, I think in terms of the aquaculture sector generally, it is a massively important sector for our economy, and particularly island communities like those I represent. But that is not to say that in terms of the environmental impacts that they have, that there isn't more that can and should be done to lessen those impacts. I think we've seen strides taken, but this is an area where, given the importance, the significance of the sector, those operating within it need to be absolutely at the cutting edge of what's happening in the sector globally. That's where our aspiration should be. And I think there are players within the sector who come far closer to that, others who perhaps have a good deal more to do. But
again, for the reinstating the 3 mile limit on inshore waters, dredging and trawling. What do you make of that?
Well, I think you're always getting conflict between active and static gear operators, and I think where there's those competing interests within the same waters, that is difficult to manage. We've seen instances in places like Shetland where you have a regulating order which is policed pretty effectively and ensures that there's a sort of cohabitation of different types of fishing, and including aquaculture, which seems to work reasonably harmoniously. So there are models that work.
Let's bring in
and ultimately, this needs to be a sustainable resource. There's no point harvesting it to a point where there's good days for the next 4 or 5 years, but thereafter, you've completely destroyed the resource.
Let's bring in the others in these two elements of aquaculture and fishing. Mags Hall first, then Brian, then Rhoda.
So the Scottish Greens support the reintroduction of the 3 mile dredging ban. It should never have been lifted in the first place. Scotland has the opportunity. We are a coastal nation. We could have a huge number of thriving coastal businesses, not just creel pots, but also things like sustainable seaweed farming, the multi-tropic farm models that are being developed in other parts of the world where you're combining seaweed and shellfish and creeling all together. And all of this at the moment is being put at risk by a very destructive sector who are often operating out with the limits of the law at the moment. So we have huge potential in our seas and for our coastal communities that's currently being damaged by the practices that we're allowing. On aquaculture, so the aquaculture sector, this is a sector that has mortality rates of up to 25% in some places. Something's going seriously wrong in our sector. And that too is also having an impact on things like wild salmon and trout fisheries and the communities that previously relied on them as well. The Scottish Parliament committees did an investigation a couple of years ago into this, and the conclusions from that said that the status quo in the aquaculture sector is not an option, and it produced a long list of recommendations are sitting, gathering dust on a shelf, and haven't been moved forward yet. I agree with Liam. I understand the economic importance of the aquaculture sector, in particular to rural areas, is huge. But if we fail to act, that will have a serious impact on these communities as well.
Thanks very much indeed. I'm just on aquaculture and fishing. Bring in the other 3 panelists, and then I'm going to invite you to make your closing comments on aquaculture and fishing. Brian Whittle, please. Then Rhoda. Then Jim Fairley. Brian, please.
Believe it or not, I know more about the problem of sea lice and salmon than you would possibly imagine, because I sat in the petitions committee during Parliament, and we actually had a huge petition and a huge investigation into this particular problem. But there are ways in which we can tackle this. So instead of using chemicals to kill sea lice, they're actually introducing wrasse into the salmon fisheries, which then eat the sea lice or take the sea lice. So it's such a huge industry for us. So we have to be really careful that we don't just sort of sweep the whole thing away. We have to look at solutions that allow that to continue. Another thing that really rattles me is that, again, we produce really good quality shellfish, but we don't have the ability to process that. We actually, believe it or not, send it to the Far East to get packaged and then bring it back before we then export it again. So I think, again, it comes back to, it's connected to a lot of things we talked about before. What we have to do is bring our the sort of fishing and our farming back into our local communities and looking after it ourselves rather than exporting that need.
Thanks for that. On aquaculture and fishing, Rhoda Grant and then Jim Fairley. Rhoda, please.
Yep. Aquaculture is really important to the rural economy. It provides jobs where there are no other jobs. But at the same time, its market depends on its reputation. So we have to make sure that reputation is high. So we need to look at where we place those farms, how we manage things like sea lice, and keep that reputation. Otherwise, the market will go and the industry will go, and it's much too important. On the wider management of fishing more widely, I like the idea of more local management. This week I had someone get in touch with me about the way the fishery was being managed, in that there was a fishery where creel fishing had been banned, but dredging was allowed to continue close by. That to me is crazy. We need to involve the local communities, the local fishers, and get them to come forward with a policy. They've fished to look after that environment. Let's listen to them, see what they're saying, and not just suddenly take a broad brush approach that actually puts in policies that damage the sea. And I think most fishing communities are very keen to farm the seas, because that's their living and that's the lifeblood of their community going forward. So we need to work.
Rhoda, thanks. I'll move to the closing statements in a minute, but on aquaculture and fishing, Jim Fairley, if you would, please.
I'll be very. We absolutely have to make sure that the salmon farming industry is protected from the point of view that we don't want it to be swept away. It is our single largest food export that we have. It's a massive success story, but that doesn't negate the fact that there are serious problems in it. And I know that Fergus Ewing is looking very closely at how we're going to tackle those problems. So again, come the next Parliament, I'm quite sure that there'll be action taken to be able to work with the industry to make sure that we maintain that reputation for world-class food and continue to support the jobs that are in these rural areas. As far as the shellfish fishermen, I found it a wee bit interesting that Brian was concerned that we're sending it to Thailand to bring them back. The biggest problem that the shell fishermen have right now is not being able to get their product down to the EU because of Brexit. So I'm not going to say any more about the shell fishermen. There's a much bigger issue that they have to deal with right now, and Brexit hasn't played it anywhere near its final role yet.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks to all for answering those questions we've discussed tonight. The question of jobs, we've discussed health, we've discussed poverty, and we've discussed finally nature and climate. Absolutely delighted to thank all those who took place. And I'm going to invite our panelists now to have a closing, just a couple of sentences if you would, a closing word really. I'm going to first to Mags Hall from the Greens. Mags, your closing comments, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Scottish Food Coalition for inviting us here this evening. It's been an interesting discussion, and as somebody who's worked in local food activism and food policy for the last 10 years, it's really interesting to finally see us start to look at the big picture of food and how just the huge number of areas of policy and life that food touches on. As Greens, we can assure you, over the next 5 years, we are going to be fully committed towards ensuring that the Scottish Parliament plays our part in helping us achieve our climate targets and that all-important net zero by 2045 target, and the food system has a massive role to play in that. So we will be pushing for an integrated Good Food Nation bill and a renewed food and renewed agricultural subsidies policy to make sure that we're using our land and our resources to the best use possible to tackle both the climate and nature emergencies.
Thank you very much indeed for your comments. And now invite Liam MacArthur to give us his closing thoughts, please. Liam.
Thanks very much, Brian, and thanks to the Coalition for hosting the hustings. Thank you more for pulling together a manifesto that I think goes some way to helping populate the Good Food Nation bill that hopefully we will see brought forward in early course in the next Parliament. I think it helps us in respect of the challenge we face in dealing with the climate emergency, the nature emergency. Scottish Liberal Democrats have made absolutely clear that the priority over the next 5 years needs to be putting the recovery first. And again, I think nothing speaks to that more eloquently than some of the issues we've been discussing this evening and which are picked up in the manifesto. So as I say, hopefully I will be in a position to help play a part in that. But Scottish Liberal Democrats are absolutely committed to it. And thanks again to the Coalition.
Liam, thanks very much indeed. And now delighted to welcome for our closing remarks, Rhoda Grant from the Labour Party. Please, Rhoda.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you to the Coalition for the work that they've done. It's been a really interesting hustings. We're a nation that produces some wonderful food. We've got a reputation for that. And yet we've got people who go hungry, and some of them are the people that are actively involved in producing that food. So we need to change that. We need a Good Food Nation bill that deals with that issue. We need to use public procurement to make sure that we're investing in our local food. We need to support those that are producing food properly through our agricultural support mechanisms. But most of all, we need to allow people to afford the wonderful produce we do. So I hope, if I am re-elected, that I play my part in that in the next Parliament. And that's why I'm asking for people's support to do that.
Rhoda, thanks for that. Delighted now to welcome Brian Whittle from the Scottish Conservatives. Brian, please.
Thank you, Brian. Can I thank the Coalition for inviting me along to speak today? It's something that I am extremely passionate about. I think if COVID has taught us nothing else, it's how health impacts the economy. I think in the next Parliament, it is absolutely crucial that the Good Food Nation bill opportunity to discuss as we have today. If you analyse what's been said today, there's so much of it we actually agree on. You know, we agree the outcomes we need. We might have a different ways of getting there, but there's so much. This kind of discussion here, I think, could develop the very bones of a good food nation bill. Maybe what we do is keep the rest of the politicians out of it, and we can sort it out between us. I think one of the key elements here, I think, is we have to support our food production. We have to keep the quality, the high quality food that we produce here in Scotland as much as possible. And as Rhoda actually alluded to there, public procurement plays a huge part in that. If I'm lucky enough to come back to Parliament next year, I will continue to push for that. I think that is a key element. And as I said, the health of the nation is, in my view, is the #1 priority. We need a cross-portfolio approach to this. And as I say, if I'm back in Parliament, that's what I'll be pushing. Thanks again, Brian.
Thanks indeed, Brian Whittle. And finally, for a closing word, Jim Fairley from the SNP. Jim, please.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you very much to the Food Coalition for inviting me along. And also thanks to the other panellists. I know we only got to spend half the time together, but it's been very good meeting you all. In terms of how we go forward from here, I've been involved in the farming industry since I was 18. I've been involved very heavily in selling food direct to the public since 1999. I established the first farmers market in Scotland back then. And I've also been involved in working to get local food into local schools. That was a project that I started. I first of all took it to Liam MacArthur's predecessor, Ross Finney. And I have to say, I didn't get an awful lot of SNP came in and John Swinney took over public procurement, that things really started to move. Brian earlier on mentioned the East Ayrshire project. The East Ayrshire project was started by a guy called Robin Gourlay, who the Scottish Government then brought into the Scottish Government in order to allow him to work with the Scottish Government to see how we were going to develop a public procurement policy. And when I first started out, the public procurement issues were price, 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 and price. And every possible block that they could put up through the local authorities was, well, we can't do anything because of the EU. Eventually, we managed to pull together, through John Swinney's direction, what we managed to pull together was a grouping of the NHS, schools, prisons. We all had a meeting in Perth, and the takeaway from that position was that we should be looking at value for money as opposed to price. And our procedures have definitely got more to go, and I understand that. But all the red meat that is delivered into Scottish schools at the moment is Scotch. So we've made massive strides. So I take some offence at some of the criticisms that have been aimed at the Scottish Government. As I say, before the SNP came into government, we didn't even have a national food policy for Scotland. It was Richard Lochhead who introduced that. In England, they're still trying to work up what a national food policy would look like, and they're copying a lot of what we are doing. So the Scottish Government have been absolutely a driving force in making sure that we protect our environment, we protect our good food industry, and we protect our farmers. And in the next Parliament, if we are lucky enough to be the government, I very much hope to be part of the system that allows us to all sit and have these conversations. And Liam, puff your cheeks out all you like. You know that all of these things that I've just said are true. And if we get the opportunity to sit in the next Parliament, we can sit and argue over the table about how we deliver it. But at the end of the day, we all want the same thing. We want a good food nation where people can get access to good quality food that's thriving, and the Ambition 2030 ambition is exactly what we should all be driving towards. And that's what
Jim Fairley, thanks very much indeed. You weren't with us throughout. You were with us for a fair weed of it, but you didn't miss your chance at the end, as was witnessed in the response from others. Look, my thanks to each and all of the speakers. I think it's been a tremendous debate tonight. Really, thanks very much indeed. Thanks to the University of Edinburgh Business School for hosting the event. Thanks to members of the Scottish Food Coalition for the videos and for organising tonight's discussion. To you and the audience for your attention. Thanks for the question. I'm really sorry I wasn't able to get to more, but I tried to get as many in as possible. And a special vote of thanks from me to our final contributor tonight. Special vote of thanks from me to Professor Mary Brennan. Mary.
Thank you very much, Brian. And what is left for me to do is to thank you for the expert moderation. You are truly a national institution. So the skill that we've seen today and how you've carefully handled the questions, seamlessly used the technology and our platform. So we are so grateful to you, and in gratitude, I will support Dundee United for 12 months and try and see. That is my gift to you in these unusual times. So thank you all, and thank you for the vibrant and fascinating debate that we've had, and how well everyone has spoken and treated each other throughout.
That's us. Thanks very much.
I think. Thank you, everyone.